The barometric pressure dropped 3 millibars in 40 minutes, and the stagnant city air smelled exactly like a struck match. I stood on the asphalt path of the city's grand botanical garden, holding my handheld digital anemometer up to the graying sky. The little metallic cups spun with a low, whistling hum. 12 miles per hour, gusting to 18. Out on the plains, a pressure drop that steep and that fast meant you'd better tie down your heavy equipment. Here in the city, surrounded by glass skyscrapers and miles of concrete, people didn't bother looking up until the rain actually hit their faces. My corporate risk assessment contract made me personally liable if a temporary structure failed during a weather advisory, so standing out here monitoring the shift wasn't optional for me. I tapped the reinforced screen of my field tablet, watching a line of angry red and purple pixels crawl across the Doppler radar return. The front was moving much faster than the morning models had predicted. A sharp clatter of a dropping metal pole made me turn my head. Leia Green stood by a stack of aluminum trussing, her hand pressed firmly to her temple. She wore a tailored navy blazer, and her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, no-nonsense knot. She was the director of this entire operation, a massive, high-stakes botanical gala scheduled for tomorrow night, and she operated with the kind of high-gear city speed that always made me feel like I was walking through wet cement. "Don't just look at the base plate, secure the locking pins," Leia instructed a vendor, her voice carrying a tight, frayed edge that cut through the ambient noise of the park. She rubbed her left temple with 2 fingers again. That was the 3rd time I'd seen her do that in the last hour. I adjusted the heavy collar of my canvas work jacket, clipped the anemometer to my belt, and walked over, my boots crunching a steady rhythm on the gravel margin. "Miss Green," I said, keeping my volume low and even. She turned sharply, her eyes darting to my tablet before meeting mine. "Alan, tell me you have good news. Tell me that ugly purple blob on the weather map is just a glitch, and it's turning out to sea." "It's not a purple blob, it's a velocity couplet," I corrected mildly, pulling up the high-resolution feed so she could see the defined hook shape. "And it's not turning. The offshore high-pressure ridge is acting like a brick wall right now. It's funneling the squall line straight down the coastline. It's going to hit us right around 4 o'clock this afternoon." Leia exhaled a short, harsh breath, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. 4 o'clock. That's when the city safety inspector is doing his final walkthrough for the main pavilion permit. If it's raining, he'll look for any excuse to delay the sign-off. "It's not just going to rain," I said, pointing a calloused finger to the leading edge of the radar return. "That indicates straight-line winds pushing ahead of the precipitation. We're looking at gusts exceeding 50 miles per hour. Those temporary vendor tents over by the Rose Garden aren't rated for that kind of sheer load." She looked at the screen, then out at the sprawling, meticulously decorated grounds. "I can't take those tents down. It took them 12 hours and 2 lifts to get them up. If we dismantle the frames now, we miss the gala opening tomorrow, and I default on the vendor contracts." "A 50-mile wind doesn't care about a contract schedule, ma'am," I said quietly. Before she could form a reply, a white golf cart zipped down the paved path and screeched to a halt beside us. A man in a spotless, high-visibility vest stepped out, clutching a waterproof clipboard. Inspector Davis. He had the rigid, uncompromising posture of a man who loved finding a missing checkbox on a triplicate form. "Miss Green," Davis said, not bothering to acknowledge me. "I'm looking at the National Weather Service advisory that just crossed my desk. They just issued a severe thunderstorm watch for the entire county." "A watch, Inspector. Not a warning," Leia countered instantly, her posture straightening as she shifted into defense mode. "Regardless of the terminology," Davis said, tapping his heavy metal pen against the plastic board, "my office requires outdoor structures exceeding 400 square feet to be certified for 60-mile-per-hour winds if a severe weather event is imminent. Those secondary marquee tents have a 40-mile rating. If they aren't struck and secured by 3:30, I am pulling your event permit for safety violations." Leia's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle jump beneath her skin. 3:30 is in 2 hours? I don't have the heavy crew on site to strike 8 massive tents in 2 hours without destroying $20,000 of floral inventory. "That is a logistics problem, not a safety problem," Davis said flatly. 3:30, Miss Green. Or the gala doesn't happen. He got back into his cart and drove off, the electric motor whining into the distance. Leia stared after him, her hands balling into tight fists at her sides. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the heavy oak branches above us and sending a cascade of dry leaves across our boots. I put my own personal savings into the deposit for this venue, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, talking more to the gravel than to me. If the city board cancels the event, I don't just lose the contract, I lose the agency. I looked at her, noting the slight tremor in her fingers before she forced her hands deep into her blazer pockets. Out where I grew up, when a neighbor's tractor broke down an hour before a freeze, you didn't stand around discussing the financial cost. You just hitched up your own team, grabbed a heavy chain, and started pulling. We don't need to strike the tents, I said. She snapped her attention back to me, her brow furrowed. Davis just stood there and said, "We do." Davis said they need a 60-mile wind rating. The canvas material itself is rated for 80. The weak point is the anchorage, I explained, scrolling past the radar to my digital site map. The rental company used standard water barrels for ballast. They aren't heavy enough to prevent lift, but if we cross-brace the aluminum frames with ratcheting storm straps and anchor them directly to the concrete retaining wall behind the rose beds, the shear load capacity doubles. It's just farm logic. You don't take the silo down in a windstorm, you just reinforce the foundation. Leia blinked, processing the mechanical information rapidly. Do you have those kind of straps? I have a utility truck full of them, I said. I don't leave home without heavy-duty rigging. Show me, she said, her tone shifting instantly from panic to execution. We walked briskly to my modified heavy-duty truck parked near the service entrance. The sky was darkening from slate gray to a bruised, heavy purple. The air pressure was still dropping, and my ears popped twice as we crossed the lot. I unlocked the steel utility bed and pulled out 2 heavy canvas duffels filled with industrial ratchet straps and drop-forged steel carabiners. It weighed a good 30 pounds, but she didn't even flinch. She just hitched the thick canvas strap over her shoulder and adjusted her stance to carry the weight. We have exactly 85 minutes before the leading edge hits, I told her, checking my heavy dive watch. We need to move. We worked in tandem. I showed her the correct angle to hook the straps to the upper truss joints 45 degrees, minimizing the lateral drag, and she mirrored my actions on the opposite side of each tent. For a city woman in a tailored suit, she didn't hesitate to kneel in the damp, soil-rich mulch or pull the heavy nylon webbing taut with her bare hands. Pull the lever back until it clicks 3 solid times, I called out over the rising, whistling wind. Like this? She asked, putting her entire body weight into the heavy steel handle. The strap snapped tight, ringing like a bass guitar string. Perfect, I said. By the time we reached the final marquee, the temperature had plummeted 15 degrees. The leaves on the massive oaks were flipping their pale undersides upward, a sure visual sign of sudden atmospheric instability. A low, continuous rumble of thunder vibrated through the thick rubber soles of my boots. I fastened the final carabiner to a steel eyelet embedded in the retaining wall and cranked the ratchet until the metal groaned. That's the last one, Leia said, breathing heavily. She pushed a stray lock of dark hair out of her eyes with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint smudge of dirt across her cheek. Before I could reply, a jagged fork of lightning cracked across the sky, followed almost instantly by a deafening, percussive boom of thunder that shook the ground. The wind didn't just pick up, it slammed into us like a physical wall of moving air. The first raindrops hit the pavement, heavy and freezing cold, the size of quarters. Command trailer. Now, I ordered. We ran across the great lawn just as the sky ripped completely open. The rain came down in solid gray sheets, instantly soaking the shoulders of my jacket. We reached the mobile command center, a 20-foot reinforced trailer I'd parked near the main electrical generator, and I pulled the heavy metal door open, ushering her inside. I stepped in right behind her and slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt and instantly shutting out the deafening roar of the wind. The trailer was cramped, dominated by a long desk supporting a bank of 4 computer monitors displaying complex weather data. The air inside smelled of warm electronics, ozone, and the damp earth we just dragged in on our boots. Rain hammered against the aluminum roof in a relentless, chaotic rhythm. Leia stood in the narrow center aisle, shivering as the trailer's air conditioning kicked in, Her blazer was soaked and heavy with water. I reached past her, keeping a polite, deliberate distance, and hit the breaker switch to kill the AC unit. Then, I opened a storage bin above the monitors and pulled out a heavy, fleece-lined red flannel shirt. "Put this on," I said, holding it out. "Before you drop your core temperature." She looked at the flannel, then at me, crossing her arms over her chest. "I'm fine, Alan. It's just water." "Your hands are shaking," I pointed out gently, nodding toward her fingers. "Where I'm from, we don't argue with wet clothes in a cold room. Just put it on." She hesitated for a second, then uncrossed her arms and took the shirt. She turned her back, peeled off the heavy, soaked blazer, and layered my oversized flannel over her blouse. The thick sleeves fell past her fingertips, and she rolled them up tightly to her wrists, the red plaid contrasting sharply with her formal work trousers. "Thank you," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharp, directing edge. "You're welcome." I turned my attention immediately to the main monitor. The radar showed a massive red core, positioned directly over our exact GPS coordinates. The wind outside was howling now, physically shaking the heavy trailer on its steel stabilizing jacks. "Are the tents going to hold?" she asked, moving to stand beside my chair. She smelled like fresh rain and a faint, expensive vanilla, a sharp and sudden contrast to the stale coffee scent of my workspace. "The straps will hold," I said, pulling up the live telemetry feed from the anemometer I'd bolted to the trailer roof. "We're reading sustained winds of 45, gusting to 52. The bracing is rated for 80. The aluminum will bend before those straps snap." She exhaled a long, shaky breath, staring at the jagged red lines of the wind speed graph. "Davis is going to have a fit when he sees we didn't take them down." "Davis will have to follow the math," I said. I reached for my battered steel thermos, unscrewed the metal cup, and poured a measure of hot, black coffee. I set it on the desk right in front of her. "Drink that. It's terrible, but it's hot." Leia picked up the cup, wrapping both of her hands around the metal to absorb the heat into her palms. She took a tentative sip, and her nose wrinkled. "You're right. It's terrible." "What is this? Instant?" "Worse. It's truck stop coffee from 6 hours ago," I said, offering a small, unapologetic shrug. She laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that seemed to fundamentally change the air pressure inside the cramped trailer. She took another long sip anyway, her shoulders finally dropping away from her ears. We sat in the small space, listening to the storm rage against the metal walls. The VHF radio crackled with a brief burst of static, followed by the automated perimeter sensor confirming the tension straps were holding steady at peak load. I kept my hand completely steady on the computer mouse even as the trailer shuddered in a heavy gust, prioritizing the incoming numbers over my own breathing. Leia stood nearby, watching the screens with a steady, intelligent focus. She didn't ask nervous, repetitive questions. She just observed the data as I worked. Suddenly, a loud, synthetic, two-tone alarm blared from my secondary monitor. I sat forward instantly, all trace of relaxation gone, my fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate the alert. The National Weather Service feed flashed a bright, warning red. "What is it?" Leia asked, stepping closer to the desk. I looked at the base velocity scan, the green and red pixels, representing wind moving toward and away from the radar site, were suddenly crashing into each other in a tight, concentrated circle just 2 miles north of our position. "Microburst," I said, my voice clipped and professional. "A massive downdraft. It's a column of rapidly sinking air that hits the ground and explodes outward in all directions. It's highly localized, but the wind shear can act exactly like a weak tornado." "Is it hitting us?" "It's hitting the North Ridge, right where the old glass greenhouse is," I said, pulling up the Botanical Garden's topographic map. Leia went completely pale. "Sarah is up there, my assistant. She went up to verify the catering staging area before the rain started. I haven't heard from her on the radio." I grabbed my handheld two-way radio from the desk. "Command to Sarah." "Sarah, do you copy?" "Static. Nothing else." "The storm interference is blocking the VHF signal," I said, clipping the radio firmly to my belt. I grabbed my heavy waterproof flashlight and a hard-shell first aid kit from the wall mount. "I'm going up there." "I'm coming with you," Leia stated, moving immediately toward the door. "No, It's not safe. You stay here and monitor the NWS feed. Alan, she said, her voice dropping all pretense of corporate polish. It was a hard command from a leader who refused to sit on the sidelines. She is my responsibility. I am not sitting in a metal box while my team is in danger. I looked at her set jaw and the fierce determination burning in her eyes. I didn't have time to argue, and frankly, I respected her absolute refusal to hide. Stay right behind me, I said, pulling the door handle. If I tell you to get down, you drop flat on the ground. Understood? Understood. I pushed the trailer door open. The wind nearly tore it from its hinges. I grabbed the exterior handle and forced it shut behind us, locking us out in the storm. We stepped out into absolute mayhem. The rain was blinding, stinging my face like thrown gravel. The sky was an unnatural, sickly, bruising green. We moved off the asphalt and onto the grass, intentionally staying away from the tall, ancient oak trees that lined the main path to avoid lightning risks. "Keep your head down!" I shouted over the roar, reaching back to grab her hand. Her fingers were freezing, but her grip was like iron, anchoring her to my pace. We fought our way up the sloping, muddy terrain toward the north ridge. The wind was a heavy, physical weight, pushing against our chests. As we crested the hill, the Victorian-style glass greenhouse came into view. It was a massive structure of wrought iron and antique glass. The outer edge of the microburst had already grazed it. One of the massive side panels had shattered entirely, leaving a gaping, jagged hole in the architecture. "Sarah!" Leia screamed, cupping her free hand around her mouth. We pushed through the heavy wooden double doors at the front entrance. Inside, the noise of the storm was magnified 10 times, echoing violently off the high glass ceilings. Potted ferns and rare, delicate orchids were scattered and smashed across the wet tile floor. "Over here!" a thin voice cried out. I swung my flashlight beam toward the back corner. Sarah, a young woman in a yellow rain slicker, was huddled completely beneath a heavy, reinforced wooden potting bench. She was clutching her left arm, looking terrified. Leia ran to her immediately, sliding on the wet, leaf-strewn tiles. "Sarah, are you okay? Are you hurt?" "A piece of glass fell from the vent," Sarah said, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "It cut my arm. I didn't want to move in case the rest of the roof came down." I knelt beside them and popped the latches on the first aid kit. I quickly inspected the cut under the beam of my flashlight. It was a shallow laceration, bleeding freely but missing the deep veins. "You're okay," I said calmly, ensuring my voice carried no panic. I pulled out a sterile pressure dressing and wrapped it tightly around her forearm. "Hold firm pressure on this. We need to get her back to the main building," Leia said, hooking her arm under Sarah's to help her to her feet. Before we could take a single step, a sound exactly like a freight train echoed directly above our heads. "Get down!" I yelled. I grabbed Leia by the shoulders, pulling her and Sarah back down beneath the heavy oak potting bench just as the dead center of the microburst passed directly overhead. The pressure differential was so extreme my ears felt tight, and the air was sucked out of my lungs. The glass roof directly above us shattered inward with an explosive crack. Glass burst downward in a hard, glittering rain. I threw my body completely over Leia and Sarah, curling my shoulders to shield them from the falling debris. Heavy pieces struck my thick canvas jacket, glancing off the heavy fabric. One jagged edge caught the back of my hand, slicing a clean, burning line right across my knuckles, but the massive spike of adrenaline masked the sting. The roar lasted for 30 agonizing seconds, then gradually began to fade into the standard, heavy drone of the thunderstorm. I stayed completely still for another 10 seconds, waiting to ensure the main structural iron wouldn't collapse on top of us. When nothing else fell, I slowly pushed myself up. My jacket was covered in shattered glass. "Are you both all right?" I asked, my throat dry. Leia looked up at me from beneath the bench. She saw the blood dripping slowly from my knuckles onto the tiles. She didn't panic or gasp. Instead, she reached directly into my open first aid kit, pulled out a fresh gauze pad, and pressed it firmly to the back of my hand. "I've got it," she said, her eyes locked completely on mine. Her voice was perfectly, unnervingly steady. She used her professional skill, managing chaos to keep the situation grounded. Sarah is fine. You shielded us. The downdraft is passing, I said, checking the barometric app on my protected phone with my good hand. The pressure is normalizing. We have a safe window to move back to the command trailer. Leia wrapped a length of white medical tape over the gauze on my hand, her touch quick, precise, and efficient. We evacuated the ruined greenhouse safely, navigating back down the muddy ridge. By the time we reached the command trailer, the heavy rain had settled into a steady, manageable drizzle. The violent edge of the storm had officially passed offshore. Inside the trailer, I fired up the diesel generator to ensure we had full, uninterrupted power. Sarah sat in the corner chair, wrapped in a silver Mylar thermal blanket, sipping bottled water. Leia stood near my desk, looking at the radar screen, which now showed mostly green and light yellow, clearing out rapidly to the east. The worst is over, I confirmed, logging the exact time of the microburst into my official incident report. The heavy metal door banged open violently. Inspector Davis stepped in, his high-visibility vest dripping water onto the rubber floor mat. "Miss Green," Davis said, his tone heavy with bureaucratic authority. "I saw the severe damage to the north greenhouse. Given the severity of this weather event, I am initiating an automatic safety shutdown of the entire property pending a full structural engineering review. The gala is postponed indefinitely." Leia stepped forward, her posture rigid, her hands balling into fists again. "Inspector, the greenhouse is a permanent structure from the 1920s, and the city board already knew it required maintenance. The event takes place on the south lawn, the temporary structures." "I haven't inspected the south lawn yet," Davis said sharply, holding up a hand to stop her. "But if a permanent glass and iron structure failed under that wind load, I can guarantee your rental tents are in the neighboring zip code. My ruling stands." I stood up, stepping smoothly between Davis and Leia. I didn't raise my voice, but I let my height and the weight of my exhaustion dictate the tone of the room. "Inspector," I said, pulling a printed, time-stamped data log from my terminal. "The greenhouse failed because it was hit by a highly localized microburst, registering a downdraft equivalent to an EF0 tornado. The south lawn, however, only experienced sustained straight-line winds of 48 miles per hour. The data proves it." "I don't care about your weather reports," Davis snapped, swatting at the paper. "I care about the structural integrity of the event space." "Then let's go look at it," I said calmly, pointing to the door. I opened the door and gestured for him to step out. Leia followed closely behind me. We walked the short distance down the paved path to the rose garden. The 8 massive marquee tents stood perfectly, immaculately intact. Not a single aluminum leg was bent. Not a single canvas roof had torn or warped. The heavy-duty ratcheting straps I had anchored to the concrete retaining wall held the structures with ironclad, unyielding rigidity. Davis walked the entire perimeter in silence, shining his heavy flashlight on the tension straps and the steel carabiners. He grabbed one of the main support poles and tried to shake it with all his weight. It didn't yield a single millimeter. "These aren't the standard water barrels," Davis noted, his tone grudgingly impressed, tracing the nylon webbing. "No, sir," I said, standing beside Leia. "Cross-braced with 10,000-pound test nylon straps, anchored directly into rebar-reinforced concrete. They'd survive a Category 1 hurricane without blinking." Davis spent another 10 minutes checking the tension points and the base plates. Finally, he clicked his flashlight off and turned to Leia. "The south lawn structures are fully compliant," Davis said, writing a quick, sharp note on his wet clipboard. "Assuming the ground dries out enough to safely run your heavy generator cables tomorrow morning, your permit for the main pavilion remains active. You can proceed." He handed Leia a signed yellow carbon copy, turned on his heel, and walked back to his golf cart. Leia stood in the damp grass, staring down at the yellow paper. She exhaled a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for 2 straight days. She turned to me, the oversized red flannel still draped over her shoulders, her dark hair slipping loose from its knot. "You saved the event, Alan," she said quietly. "I just tied some knots," I replied, feeling that familiar, awkward discomfort in my chest whenever someone tried to hand me praise. "You're the one who kept your head straight under pressure. Most directors would have been screaming at the sky." She looked down at the paper, then back up at me. "I don't know how to thank you." A dry shirt tomorrow wouldn't hurt, I noted dryly. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. Deal. The next evening, the sky was a brilliant, washed clean blue. The oppressive humidity had completely broken, leaving the coastal air crisp and clear. The grounds of the Botanical Garden were completely transformed. Caterers in black vests moved swiftly between the pristine white tents, and thousands of string lights were already glowing softly in the late afternoon shadows, reflecting off the crystal centerpieces. I sat on the dropped tailgate of my truck, logging the final weather data packet into the corporate server. My job was technically done. The threat was zero. Usually, this was the exact moment where I packed up my gear, turned in my final invoice, and drove 3 states away to sit alone in my cab and chase the next low-pressure system. But I hadn't packed the truck. Leia walked across the gravel lot. She wasn't wearing a blazer today. She wore a simple, elegant, dark green dress that moved beautifully when she walked. Her hair pinned up, a clipboard tucked under one arm. She looked completely in her element, the master of her domain, directing the final touches with absolute authority. She stopped at the edge of my tailgate. "The caterers are setting up the VIP tables," she said, checking a line on her clipboard. "I have an empty seat at table 4, near the front." I looked at the clipboard, then up at her. "I'm a weather contractor, Leia. My boots have mud on them." "I don't care about the boots," she said, holding my gaze with a steady, uncompromising weight. "Sit at table 4 with me." I closed my laptop, the heavy latch clicking sharply in the quiet air. I had spent my whole life standing on the edge of the storm, watching other people's houses, protecting other people's towns. I was used to being the guy who secured the perimeter and drove away before the party actually started. But looking at her, I realized that avoiding the center of the room didn't make me safe. It just made me lonely. "Give me 10 minutes to change," I said. She smiled, a real, wide smile that reached her eyes. "Table 4. Don't be late." 3 hours later, the gala was in full, vibrant swing. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner of the main pavilion. The air inside the tent smelled of expensive catering and damp, blooming roses. I stood near the edge of the tent, holding a glass of sparkling water. I had put on my one clean dress shirt and a dark jacket. Leia was navigating the crowd flawlessly, shaking hands with board members and wealthy donors. Every time she finished a conversation, her eyes would drift across the room, find me standing by the structural support pole, and she would offer a small, grounding nod. Eventually, she excused herself from a group of city councilmen and walked over to my quiet corner, bringing the chairman of the board with her. "Marcus," Leia said, her voice clear and carrying perfectly over the low murmur of the crowd. "I want to introduce you to Alan Thompson. He's the reason we are standing in a dry, secure tent tonight." The chairman shook my hand firmly. "Miss Green told us about the structural bracing. Mr. Thompson, brilliant work, under pressure." "Thank you, sir," I said, keeping it brief. "In fact," Leia continued, turning to look directly at me, "I've just informed the board that Alan is staying on as our lead risk consultant for the entire summer season. I just signed the extension contract." The chairman nodded his approval and drifted back toward the bar. Leia stepped closer to me, pulling 2 items from her small clutch purse. She held out a heavy, plastic all-access vendor badge on a lanyard, and beneath it, a prepaid cab voucher. "I arranged a cab and set up a quiet staff office for you to decompress," she said, her voice dropping so only I could hear. Her eyes held a fierce, uncompromising care. "I didn't want you driving back to the plains exhausted. No driving, no risk." I looked at the voucher, then up at the woman who had spent the last 48 hours fighting for everything she had built. The air around us just smelled incredibly clean after the storm. I didn't take the cab voucher. Instead, I reached out and gently squeezed her hand, my thumb brushing over her knuckles, before holding up my battered steel thermos. I confessed, I already brought a fresh pot of terrible coffee inside. I decided an hour ago I wasn't leaving. She looked down at the thermos, letting out a soft, shaky exhale that had nothing to do with the weather, and her fingers tightened around mine. I learned that true courage isn't just about facing a storm. It's about deciding to stay and build something lasting after the wind stops blowing. Real love isn't about drama or chaos. It's about consistency, creating safety, and showing up when it counts. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.